Hi, and welcome to Night Clerk Radio. This is episode 63, Hauntology 2.0. With me, as always, is my co-host, Burke. How you doing?
Okay. We're recording this a little later than normal, so I'm tired. But
oh, no.
It's okay. I'm a professional.
You are a professional, even in the hardest of circumstances.
It's true.
Yeah, so we're going back. We're revisiting our old haunts in Hauntology 2.0. Mm-hmm. In particular, I want to look at one record label called Ghostbox Records, which actually Mark Fisher wrote about. And I looked at one of their newest album releases. And why is that record label defined as hauntological? Why? Because there's hauntological, the cultural and the philosophical concept that we've talked about, but there's also literally a music genre called hauntology. And it is a very specific music genre, and in some ways kind of mirrors or foreshadows vaporwave, and I'll explain that in a bit. But yeah, hauntology, it's a big deal. It turns out the past is haunting the present.
It is, yeah. So we did a whole episode on hauntology because it's kind of one of those we used to call them like pillar concepts. Mm-hmm. There's like plunderphonics and hauntology were the big two. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I mean, that was a long time ago. We've been doing the show for a couple of years now. Oof. Yeah, that is a true statement.
Yep. Time keeps on happening.
It sure does, unfortunately. But anyway, since that time, I have read a lot, I've thought about a lot, I've interacted with a lot of different genres. So it's kind of refining hauntology because I thought it was interesting, first of all, that things were calling themselves hauntology. Like I knew it was a genre, but one of the inspirations for this episode was a listener on our Discord, FFB, posted the album that I'll be doing and was like, the liner notes are very pretentious and they use weird phrases like Hauntology 2.0, but it's actually really good. You should listen to it, which we did. We'll talk about it later. Yeah. Which kind of revived some aspects of Hauntology and talking about it that we didn't really get into so much in our first episode, which is, there's really two parts that I have learned since then. Number one, reading it, I didn't realize that Derrida coined the term hauntology as a pun between like ontology and haunted in French. But that a lot of this also goes back a little bit before that to like Jameson, who talked about the nostalgia mode in postmodernism, Culturological Late Capitalism, kind of his most popular book, where even then identified this obsession with remakes, recapturing the past, not doing anything new, et cetera, which then that combined with the term hauntology from Derrida kind of was picked up by Fisher into what he talked about with hauntology and terms we've used before, like the slow cancellation of the future.
Yeah.
Which is not just that we're not making new things in the media sense, but that literally our perceptive horizon is shrinking to the point where we can't even conceive of alternate futures other than neoliberal capitalism in which we're embedded. Like it just subsumes even your entire imagination.
Yeah. Like, I mean, if you think of popular culture, after World War II, there was like, oh, we're going to have the future. We're going to have our flying cars, the Jetsons and all these other things. And popular science and mechanics would popularize like ideas of how future technology and how we're going to live in a utopia. And it was a very, there's a blog, Paleo Future, I believe, that sort of like documents a lot of these lost futures. And now we don't even get that because talking about the future is almost always universally negative. Like there's very few people who believe that we're going to have flying cars in the future outside of maybe, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk flying their two cars around or something like that. You know what I mean? So
there's a great bit about this in, I'm a little more hit or miss on him than some of our other friends, but in Tim Rogers' Cyberpunk 2077 video, there's a little bit about this, about like the decaying aesthetic of cyberpunk. Whereas like, if you look at like cyberpunk 80s, 90s media, like nascent internet, and they were already envisioning like this whole future, right? Like all this VR stuff, just completely futuristic stuff, like a truly alternate future than the one we're living in now. And if you look at like 2077, which is just standard corporatist shit, which we live in, like cyberpunk in 2020 just looks like 2020, but with a little more neon. Like, like that's basically the rough point, is that even that imaginative horizon in speculative genres has decayed.
Yeah. So I think that's a good way to start talking about Ghostbox Records, because Ghostbox Records is very focused on a period of British history where before this vision came to dominate media. And it's very specifically, the founders talk about being inspired by like 1958 to 1978, that 20-year period specific to the United Kingdom, where it was actually more utopian, but there were still like underlying anxieties. So yeah, Ghostbox Records is kind of like a grab bag of cultural ideas and icons and themes that have been mashed together into a music label, or into a music genre and a record label. But I think that's sort of like the idea is like, 1958 to 1978, at least in Britain, it was more like popular culture was more utopian, the belief that we would progress and have a technocratic, great, march, we beat the Nazis. We're gonna do great. And then it all fell apart. When did Thatcher come into power again? Probably around then.
Yeah. That's the most interesting thing about doing some of this additional reading for this episode is how uniquely British Hauntology really is. And that it's for the 70s, like you said.
It's 1958 to 1978 is the specific, like that, like they're very specific in what they call their inspirations. There's an essay about them called Haunted Audio, the Society of the Spectral, Ghostbox, Modern Music and Hauntology by Simon Reynolds from 2006 that goes into this more details. So they talk about one part sort of like cosmic horror and folk, what we call now folk horror, which are like Hammer films, folklore referencing British pagan history. And so take one part of that, but also take the spirit of technocratic utopianism that flourished in post-war Britain. From the misunderstood brutalist school in architecture, they meant well, really, they did, to the democratization of learning undertaken by the Open University and further manifested by 1960s paperback explosion as pioneered by Penguin Books with its blue-spined drive to educate the common man. So there's a penchant for all things atavistic and heathen, to a nostalgia for the future, a wistful harking back to the optimistic, forward-looking, benignly bureaucratic Britain of new towns and garden cities, comprehensives, and polytechnics. So, yeah, so Ghostbox is trying to evoke this very specific period in British history, which we've seen sort of like the trace elements, like how people only know things because they're referenced in The Simpsons.
Sure.
So we only know it through things like the comedic series Look Around You. And that's sort of like referencing a whole era of British educational films made for, literally school children, and things like Scarfolk. I wouldn't say Garth Marenghi, but maybe a little bit, at least with the music, because Garth Marenghi is referencing later stuff. But
it's a little after this, I think.
So they're taking all of these elements together, all these sort of like weird cosmic horror and folk horror, and then like British technocratic utopianism of the 60s and 70s, and merging it into a music genre. Because there's also the time period when analog synthesizers came to be popular. And then we had things like, the very first Doctor Who theme, that's obviously, I would think, an element of inspiration as well for Ghostbox. So yeah, it's quite fascinating because, again, both of us are coming into this as outsiders.
Yeah.
Like we have no referent material. We only know the references, not the referent. So it's pretty fascinating to try and pick up on this stuff. But it's still compelling music for me in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I really liked your album, which is a Ghostbox record album. Yeah, the reason I mentioned the 70s specifically is just because it comes up as kind of the target decade in this book I think you read the intro of, but it's Hauntology, Ghosts of Futures Past by Merlin Coverley. And it talks about this and how not only are we outsiders, but also our hauntology is completely different, which is the 80s. We're completely dominated by the 80s here. Whereas, like you're saying, the 70s, the 50s to the 70s, of course, but the 70s being the last decade before Thatcher and neoliberalism kind of crushed everything. So there's a supporting quote to your point in here that talks about, it cites the Festal of Britain in 1951 as kind of the start of this post-war consensus in Britain. But it has, quote, a cultural ecology loosely shaped by public service broadcasting, post-punk, Brutalist Architecture, your favorite, Penguin Paperbacks, oddly specific, also a favorite of mine, and the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. And then talks about how the collapse of those structures and those institutions really led to what Fisher sees today. Largely for Fisher, it was kind of 1973 with the fall of the Allende government in Chile.
Oh, yeah.
Is what he really sees as like the most blatant overthrow of like another free society by neoliberal capitalism to its own ends. And he has a great quote, the post-war consensus disintegrating on black and white TV. That's how Fisher put it.
Dang. Yeah. You know, another thing that the essay I mentioned is Boards of Canada as a reference point. And, you know, I think that's one of the reasons why I like this Ghostbox music so much is because it reminded me a lot of Boards of Canada. So Boards of Canada being like, you know, a Scottish duo that uses a lot of like referencing, literally sampling old educational films and using analog synthesizers. So we get this kind of like whole spectrum of like Boards of Canada and then like Aphex Twins, more ambient work, and a lot of other artists based in the UK. And then now it's sort of distilled into this like really rarefied kind of like genre work of just, well, not genre work, but like genre music referencing this. I don't know. It's fascinating. It's like vaporwave, but it's like one record label and that's all they do. So there's like, you know, about a dozen artists, it seems like, for Ghostbox, and they have a very specific vibe and they've stuck to it for like almost 20 years now. It was formed in I think 2004 by a graphic designer and a musician. The graphic designer's named Julian House, and he does most of the album art to give all of the records sort of a unified look. And the producer, Jim Jupp, who is also part of Bellbury Polly, which is the studio band of Ghostbox Records. So I started this I went up looking the Hauntology playlists and Hauntology mixes, and there's like Spotify playlists that list like Bellbury Polly and, you know, the Advisory Circle and all these other artists that I've barely heard of. So I started digging, and here we are.
I think a lot of the other stuff about Hauntology probably is going to come up in the context of the music, but one last little thing on Ghostbox. This is just a question for you. Maybe the answer is no. We always talk about Fisher, and he's sort of the most popular. But Simon Reynolds also wrote a lot about Ghostbox and that sort of UK cultural phenomenon. Have you read much of his stuff? Because I never have, and I feel like I should.
I have not read. I've read some of his stuff, but I have not read a whole lot. Like, I mean, that was Simon Reynolds I was quoting earlier. So yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, I'm not very familiar with him.
Well, we'll save that for the Hauntology 3.0.
Yeah.
Blockchain episode.
Yeah. We could do just a podcast just about exploring Hauntology. It's a pretty active scene, actually, because again, they're releasing records. Ghostbox is still releasing records 20 years later, and they're still very good.
Which we're about to find out.
That was a bit of Entangling Routes. This is track 2, Synaptic. It is by Pye Corner Audio. I may be mispronouncing it as Pye, so I assume it's Pye or P. I always mix up the pronunciation.
Just yell at us.
Yeah. So Pye Corner Audio, I've actually seen a lot of his work. He was listed a lot in these playlists, and it was an intriguing name for an artist. I looked it up. He's been around a while, producing over a dozen albums, I believe. He started work in 2010 with the Black Mill tapes, Volume 1. His real name is Martin Jenkins. He is an electronic musician who's worked on a lot of other groups. He's worked with Mogwai, and he has, I believe, done some soundtrack work, but I can't find it off the top of my head. Yeah, Entangled Routes is the third part of a loose trilogy of albums, starting with Stasis in 2016 and followed by Hollowed Earth in 2019. So the concept, this is technically a concept sci-fi album. The idea of mycorrhizal networks, or like fungal networks, and human attempts to listen in and communicate. So it's, yeah, now there is actually kind of a thing of people plugging in wires to mushrooms and recording the sounds that come out. So it's like a bioacoustic thing, I believe it's called. Yeah, the sound of mushrooms. Yeah, it is. Let's see here. Here, I'll put a link to a YouTube video. Through the use of biodata sonification and a Eurorack synthesizer, we're able to listen to mushrooms perhaps for the first time. So anyways, that's not from this album. This is just a thing that electronic musicians are figuring out.
Right.
So I guess it's kind of vibing on that. So yeah, I like this album. It is a lot faster paced than what we usually listen to. It's almost like house music or EDM, various flavors. There's a lot of variation between like the fast tracks and then like shorter, like more ambient tracks to like kind of a cool down thing. Before we get into specific tracks, what were your thoughts, Burke?
Yeah, I really liked it. I was kind of surprised because I guess I didn't know what to expect. So I shouldn't have been surprised. I shouldn't have had any expectations. But yeah, I thought my first listen through felt like the most, I'm going to say conventional, but I don't mean it that way. Like just album we've listened to on the show ever.
Yeah.
It doesn't, it's very straightforward. I always called it like electro ambient. That's just a personal name. I don't know if there's a better genre name other than like hauntological music or whatever. And I absolutely loved it. I think it's probably one of my favorite things to work to that we've listened to in a long time. It gave me a lot of the same feelings. It doesn't sound the same, but it gave me a lot of the same feelings as like in 2013 or whatever. I used to listen to the FTL soundtrack all the time. While working. Just a lot of like varied pacing, but a variety of synths, arpeggiators, beat boops, all that stuff, which I thought came through in this. I listened to this one a lot just because it was so enjoyable to listen to and to work to.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to look up some of Pie Corner Audio's other albums and see if they vibe as well. I did read a couple of reviews of this album, people all very positive. So I quite like it. It has, and I think this is like, again, some of the things we're just kind of missing these references because this is like the analog, like very warm and fuzzy kind of sound for a synth, which I associate with like 70s analog synthesizers. And that definitely would be like something the Radiophonic Workshop would have done for children's sci-fi or something like that. Like we get to some dark ambient kind of stuff like track 3, Paleolith, not lithic, is, has these sweeps and synth pads. It's very science fiction. It's also very short too. But then track 4, it almost felt like the beginning of the intro to a Nine Inch Nails song. Like I was just expecting Trent Reznor starts singing about being addicted to heroin or murdering somebody like at any point with these like really sinister kind of phaser beeps. Like,
yeah. But there's nice little like melody accents and stuff through it in the background. So I just like that really layered production while we're in that area. Cause standout tracks for me were track 2, which you sampled, of course. I really love that track, but even the next one, The Creeper, I really liked those long sweeping drones and then like a little bit of a repetitive kind of synth lead in the background, but largely just like there's like filter sweep drone synths. You just have some low frequency oscillator just pushing you back and forth I love listening. Yeah, that stuff's great to listen to.
Oh yeah. No, it's extremely good. Yeah. Let's play another sample. that is from track 7, The Clearing, which I like. There's this sort of like arpeggio coming up from the synth pads, and then it kind of like it goes really hard in you can listen to in that sample. Like there is a like I do like that there's a good variety on this album. Like I thought like the next track 8 almost sounded like a PS1 kind of JRPG wandering through the wasteland kind of track.
Mm-hmm.
And there's more of this sad, like mournful kind of ambient tracks later on. Yeah, it does sort of like evoke a lot of different, like it's all consistent, but yet there is still a lot of variety. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I really like it's a very masterful use of these types of synthesizers. Yeah, it's definitely a vibe.
Yeah, I think all the best tracks just have like great mood and atmosphere. Like you can immediately put imagery to them. I think that's usually for this type of stuff.
Yeah,
what stands
especially
out
for
to
a
me.
concept album. Yeah, like it would be very easy. I don't know how easy, but it would definitely be possible to adapt this into like a movie soundtrack or a TV show soundtrack of some kind.
Yeah, because some other standouts along that were track 10, like Phantom Orchid was one. Again, I think the tracks I tend to be these like slightly slower paced, darker ones. Just re-listening and rethinking about them now. All the ones I wrote down as like standout tracks. So the last one being Symbiosis, track 13 was my last kind of standout track.
Oh yeah, it's very cosmic. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. There's drums. It's got structure and movement, especially the part around like 140.
Why don't we just add a little sample there?
A lot of this stuff just really grabs you.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. So I think I can see parallels between Ghostbox Records and Hauntology and vaporwave because like Ghostbox, was a curated experience, masterminded by the two founders, the Julian and House and Jim Jupp, to create the music and the design aesthetic, the sensibility. But they're calling from a very specific period of nostalgia and kind of vibing on it to create different moods in the listener and to not just imitate it, but to like go beyond it to like, I think that's the difference between, ripping someone off and an homage is to take the same ideas and do something new with it. So I think that's what this album does is take the musical ideas of like 1970s British sci-fi made for children or for, educational films and these sort of music and make something more complex and satisfying to listen to. But like vaporwave was kind of taking the same things of like taking the period of the past and taking its ideas musically and its design and then sort of repurposing it and making it into something more interesting. But it was not controlled by a single record label. It was just a broad internet movement. Yeah, I can see parallels between the two. I kind of wanted to keep digging into Ghostbox a bit to see what to see if it has anything to say about vaporwave.
Yeah, I would say that was like the biggest gain out of this is just making me want to listen to other stuff on Ghostbox. First of all, how varied a record label is it? Yeah. Like how much stuff sounds like this. I have to imagine that over almost 20 years, there's a lot of different stuff on there.
Yeah.
Even listening to the rest of this trilogy would be interesting, but the whole label really getting into it is what's most interesting to me, I think.
Yeah, they have a lot of different albums, just current, like not even their out of print stuff, but just looking at the album covers on their website, there's a lot. Like in a sense, it's got a very unified, like a lot of the Penguin, soft paperback books. Like it's very evocative of these in a lot of ways. Yeah, no, I'm really curious about this to keep on digging it. So yeah, it looks like they have 16 artists listed on there, something like that. Yeah. So yeah, no, it's definitely worth investigating.
That was from about 3.5 minutes into track 1 Somewhere off our second album, U, I, UI, by Olivier Allery and Johan Malfatti, a collaboration between the former being Canadian-based and the latter being Berlin-based, as well as a handful of live instruments, guest artists, vocalists, samples. It's a very interesting album. This is the one that was recommended to us by our listener, FFB, and has very long and interesting, but kind of self-important liner notes. Mm-hmm. Quite frankly, talking a lot about the process and their history and music composing and all their accomplishments, but also their thought process going in. And the general premise of the album is that it's an experimented / haunted project. I'm going to assume it's COVID inspired, but I don't know actually how long they were working on it, because they were already in kind of a distance, working relationship before COVID. But the whole premise is about like being both connected and distanced by the internet and VoIP chat software, specifically using voice chat software like Skype, FaceTime, Hangouts, Messenger, etc., as a plugin for their production by either running audio through it, recording over it. There was one thing they talked about where they would use little delays and feedback to kind of mess with their bandwidth to trigger basically whatever that particular app's lag effects are. Mm-hmm. And like using that as an effect. So using it as like a tunable, like literally like a plugin in a DAW. Then there's also a lot of plunderphonics of sampled moments where they capture people in quote honest and vulnerable in intimate settings. So people who are maybe being recorded and don't realize it because they're left their Skype on or whatever like that. But boy, the end result is a captivating listen. Mm-hmm. I really like this album. It is not a chill album to work to in the same way as yours to me. I found it very hard to concentrate while it's on.
Yeah, it's a very sad.
It's sad and eerie.
Yeah, sad and eerie. It is. Yeah, first off, it is predates COVID. It was pieced together between 2017 and 2019, although its genesis dates back 15 years. Of course, obviously, it is more relevant than ever because of COVID. It was released in September 25th of 2020, so very, very appropriate timing.
Yeah.
And yeah, my initial thoughts just listening to the first couple of tracks, I was like, yeah, this is the Caretaker for being, but online. Like this is very. Mm-hmm. I immediately thought of the Caretaker because it is using these voices, using the broadcast medium of VoIP as a way to emphasize the the attempt to connect and yet still disconnected, and the alienation from being isolated, yet being able to talk to someone online like that. All those contrasts, like it really hammers in that with these very mournful, very sad tracks. Like it's lo-fi production aesthetic at its best, I think, to really re-emphasize again these themes of disconnection and alienation. So yeah, I quite liked it too. I did not listen to it as much because it's a more meditative album rather than a just put it on and get to work kind of album. Yeah, but definitely a rewarding listen to.
I agree. Yeah, so I think the first thing before the music, while we're still kind of on the topic of the album conceptually, and I kind of missed the 15 years in production thing, but I did immediately think of like Caretaker or like Basinski, like Disintegration Loops type stuff. Another one that comes up a lot to me was Max Richter. I don't know if you listen to much of his stuff. He was a UK composer, sort of like a contemporary classical guy.
Oh, okay.
You have probably at least heard one of his songs, which is On the Nature of Daylight off the Blue Notebooks, which is probably one of his more famous projects, is played at the beginning and I think at the end of Arrival.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So, like, you've probably heard it. It's like a kind of a famous, like, sad violin piece. So I also felt like there's a lot of that in here.
Yeah, there's a lot of like chamber music.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But I think broadly the kind of being like hauntological music commenting on something as recent as like voice chat is kind of interesting, because that's another thing that comes up a lot in both the Coverley book and Fisher in general, is the absolute subsuming of everything by Hauntology, because as your future horizon shrinks, we talked about this with Caleb even, so does your past horizon in some sense. Like they're kind of connected, like you become kind of perpetually trapped in a smaller and smaller bubble of time. And it's sort of interesting because it's just such a recent thing to be hauntological for, to be haunted by something that is still ongoing, because it's really not either one of like Fisher's sort of hauntology things, which is like stuff that's already happened and stuff that is yet to happen. So like, can you like trying to be hauntological and nostalgic for the present when the past has become the ever present? And can you even be nostalgic anymore if like everything, no matter how recent, can just be folded up in this hauntological melancholy? I don't know. It's interesting to me how recent the kind of that commentary side of it is.
Yeah.
Like conceptually, that's the only thing with the album that kind of was like, I don't know.
Well, I mean, looking at the specifics of this album, like they get these anonymous voice samples from, Skype conversations or something like that. They don't really say how they get them, but like, I could imagine if you just search on YouTube for Skype conversation grandma, you could find 1,000 unlabeled videos, or something like that. So, and in some ways that sort of serves the same. YouTube's become basically the thrift store where if you could find 100 unlabeled VHS tapes and pop them in, find random home movies, at the Goodwill. And so like, 20 years ago, that's what artists do if they wanted to create this kind of mood or vibe or comment on that and source that plunderphonic style. But now we're using, randomly found Skype conversations from some source on the internet that are, here now, but, deleted an instant later or never found again because of the algorithm or whatever. So, and there is this extremely like haunted quality to like voice over IP conversations, because they randomly, sound staticky. They're distort the voice. There's random disconnections, and people have been doing this for like 20 years now. Like it's like Skype's been around since what, like 2005, 2006. Yeah. It's kind of like, I'm just looking it up now. Sorry.
No worries.
18 years ago, initial release was 2003. So about the same time Ghostbox Record came in. So
there you go.
Yeah. So yeah, this is also like, I mean, it's commenting on like how technology changes society, how it changes our relationships. I mean, it's also extremely haunted in just the way it is. Again, just it sounds almost like a ghost movie at times. Like there's parts where it is like grandma's ghost is haunting the PC. Let's call it Geek Squad and hope they can exercise it. So yeah, I like this album, but yeah, it's not a casual listen to. It's not as intense as The Caretaker, but it's definitely along that spectrum.
By virtue of not being 6 hours,
Yeah. Well, it's also like the Caretaker, like it gets so much worse as the albums go on, and like this one is more consistent. Like it ends with this sad piano, but it's still very gentle. So
yeah.
Talk
Talk about tracks real quick, but before that, I just want to remind people what we're listening to and kind of play another sample of another track I really liked. Track 5, My Night, My Day. So I picked this because this is probably one of, I don't know if that's fair to say without listening to them all in detail immediately before saying it, but one of the more like active tracks. Like it goes through a lot of modes. It starts off with kind of eerie, ominous. I don't want to say synths because I don't know what's being processed through these like Skype plugins and stuff that they used. There's like chanting, instruments, drums pounding, distorted voices. Like it's just
it's a lot. It's a very. I really like the breathy vocals in it. It was a very good touch.
Yeah, I think the vocal processing is something that's very interesting because like track 4, Drifting, also has that a lot, where it's not quite call and response, but it is like clearly like a string quartet playing something very melancholy, somber, and this like modulated warbly voice.
Yeah, warbly.
Yeah, just like.
I also like the radio distortion track 4, so bringing back that number station kind of weirdness.
The violins on track 2, I Can't Even See Myself, are what I was thinking of when I was saying like kind of Max Victory. Not exactly. I don't say it sounds like it, but it's just also like a UK mid-aughts composer. So I'm curious. He's a little bit. I guess I don't know anything about Fire Corner Audio exactly, but I think he was being like just a little bit older, a little bit more established at this time. He wasn't like just starting now.
Yeah.
I will say that I think in terms of talking about tracks independently, at some point, kind of tracks 5 through 9 are all kind of like different experiments on the same idea. You know, the general concept of the album, so I have like a little bit less to say individually about those tracks.
Yeah. I mean, the opening tracks are really strong. Yeah, really immediately hooked me on the album. And tracks, the middle, tracks 5 through 9, I would agree. They're not quite samey. Like I like track 7, LO added because it has that radio static. The slow piano. It kind of reminded me like a Silent Hill soundtrack, which is a good thing for this kind of album.
Yeah, because I do think every track is interesting, but I do think kind of 4 and 5 are sort of the peak. And then I think maybe the novelty wears off a little bit, and then it does just become like a lot. You know, like just every track has so much happening that it does just become a lot to listen to.
Yeah,
I think largely the issue rather than the music itself, but just that it's a lot to take in.
Yeah, because it's so sad. You know, they really nail like these people talking in the darkness. Like there's no, like it's a person talking, but there's no conversation. I guess that's the main thing. There's no, like there is kind of a call and response thing on some tracks, but it's never in sync like an actual conversation. So everyone's talking alone out in the darkness and they're all alone. God, yeah. I just realized that. Now it's even sadder. So
yeah, it's a cohesive whole, but each part of it just feels very atomized. Yeah.
Yeah, atomized. That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you want to feel blue, like this is a great album, but it is hauntingly beautiful. Thanks for listening to this episode. Our next episode is going to be a memorial to Caesar Alexander, who is known in vaporwave circles as Linshaven Virtual Plaza and in dark ambient as Mount Shine, who was a cryochamber artist. And I did not realize Caesar was both artists, and I liked all of his work, really. And so his last album ever was recently released on Cryochamber, and we'll be looking at some of his vaporwave music as well. And yeah, he died last year due to COVID, so he passed away far too early. But he left behind a legacy of great music, so we'll be talking about that. And don't forget, we have a Patreon, patreon.com/nightclerkradio. Our next Patreon episode is going to be talking about the new Too Mellow album, and also talking about artists and franchises and what that means. So if you want to talk to us, we are at Night Clerk Radio on Twitter. I'm at Ross Payton, and Burke is at Burke McBurkinson. We also have a website, nightclerkradio.com, Facebook page, and please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, whatever you listen to. Tell your friends, tell your enemies, tell strangers about Night Clerk Radio, and keep listening. Bye.
Bye.